So I'm really excited about our kickoff session this morning. Mr. Bilahari Kausikan has always been one of our most popular speakers here, and so I think that you'll all really enjoy hearing from him. He has been affectionately known as the undiplomatic diplomat. He was the former permanent secretary for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Singapore. He was there for 37 years and has done a number of things, including serving as ambassador to Russia. So he is experienced in talking about China, Russia, trade, everything from the effects of COVID to where things are going from here. He enjoys answering pointed questions, so I hope that you bring them for him. And are we all set? Okay, all right, great. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Mr. Bilahari Kausikan.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you for inviting me back again. Seems a little bit incautious of you, but I'm happy to be here. Now, I don't want to subject you to a monologue, so I've been asked to talk about U.S. China relations, which means we could be here for a week, at least a week. But I don't want this to be a monologue. I would like this to be a dialogue, so I'll try to keep my opening remarks pretty brief, maybe no more than 15 to 20 minutes, right? But I do want to put a few points on the table as a kind of framework for discussion. Actually, the topic given to me was U.S. China relations, I think, if I remember correctly, after COVID or something like that. But the issues really go beyond COVID. Even if there was no pandemic, there would have been the same issues. Perhaps the only effect of the pandemic was to accelerate things a little bit and accentuate things a little bit. Let me start by giving you a very, very brief historical kind of perspective. From 1972, when the US and China first re-established contact after some years of hostility from 1949, it's very hard to put a precise date, but let's say to around 2008, 2009, when the global financial crisis broke out. There were periods of tension and there were differences over issues like Taiwan and human rights, and of course, particularly after Tiananmen in 1989. But overall, the emphasis of US-China relations was on engagement. Now that has flipped. There will be still engagement, as you all know, I think. There have been a whole series of high-level contacts between the US and China. The most recent is Janet Yellen was in Beijing. Right? But the overall emphasis now is clearly on competition. There will be periods of high-intensity competition, lower-intensity competition. And as I said, engagement is not going to cease completely because neither side, I think, is really looking to get into a fight. But the overall emphasis is on competition. This is now a new structural feature of international relations. What caused the flip? I think you don't have to look for very sophisticated arguments. I'm a great believer in Occam's razor. You look for the simplest possible explanation with the least possible assumptions you need to make. What brought them together was their common enemy, the Soviet Union. No Soviet Union, there was nothing to hold them together. Right? I think I should make another point of historical perspective. It's quite important because looking around the room, I think most of you are below 50, considerably below 50, right? Now, if you are below 50, then you may not have realized that actually competition between major powers is the natural condition of international relations, right? It was only a very short and possibly historically abnormal period from 1989, when the Berlin Wall came down, that this harsh fact of international relations, that competition is the natural state of affairs, was masked by the overwhelming dominance of the United States. Well, that period is over. It's not going to be recreated. As I said, competition is the norm. We have actually returned to a more historically normal state of relations. In fact, if you look, the 20th century is one of the most bloodiest centuries in world history. First World War, Second World War, Korean War, Vietnam War, numerous smaller wars. Soviet Union invasion of Afghanistan, of Czechoslovakia, of Afghanistan, and numerous smaller wars that were connected with the process of decolonization. And over all this was the shadow of U.S. Soviet Union competition, which made many of those smaller wars, small meaning in scale. I mean, if you are killed in a small war, you are killed in a world war, you are still dead. Huh? So it doesn't really matter. Many of them proxy wars. We are now back, and even during that short and historically abnormal period, say 15, 20 years from 1989 to say 2008, when the global financial crisis brought about widespread disillusionment with American-led globalization, including among many Americans. The US invaded Iraq, the US invaded Afghanistan. There were vicious genocidal wars in the Balkans and in Africa, Rwanda in particular. So war, competition turning into war, this is natural. For most of your adult lives, this was masked, I think, by the fact of US dominance. A contested international order is normal. After all, the international order was contested for about 40 years after the Second World War between the US and the Soviet Union. Now, I don't mean by pointing out this, but I think it's important that you understand the perspective, because I see too much excited reporting. If you are a journalist, I guess that's understandable because you have to report on what happens. But that distorts perspective, actually. Not very much of what has happened, let us say, in the last decade or so, is really all that new. I'm not saying that there is nothing new, but they fall into the category of what the late Donald Rumsfeld, who was Secretary of Defense, called known unknowns. And that includes Ukraine war. These are known unknowns. There are many unknowns, but they are known kind of unknowns. It's not that, but you know, I don't mean to suggest by this that everything is, you know, that is just a replay of an old movie. It's not. One of the things that irritates me no end is the idea that U.S. China competition is a new Cold War. There are some superficial similarities between U.S. Soviet Union competition, but they are superficial. To call it a new Cold War, as too many people who ought to know better do, because it's a very simple way of describing things, but it's also intellectually lazy and fundamentally misrepresents the nature of the competition. Can be dangerous, because if you misrepresent the competition, you can't deal with it properly. And I'm talking about third countries, right? What's the difference? Well, the US and the Soviet Union both led to entirely different systems, and that were connected with each other only at the margins. The Soviet Union was never a very major actor in the global economy except in its own sphere of influence, right? And in certain specific domains like energy. Right? And their competition was an existential competition to see which was the better way of organizing modern industrial society, the communist way or the capitalist way. I think that has more or less been settled, you know, right? China calls itself a socialist country with Chinese characteristics. It's probably better described as a country organized on Han nationalism with socialist characteristics, because it is a capitalist economy, a mixed capitalist economy, not totally, right? And I'll come back to this because in recent years, in the last decade under President Xi Jinping, the socialist elements have been re-emphasized, shall we say. Not to China's benefit, by the way. But by contrast, I said, U.S. Soviet Union, two different systems. The competition is between these two systems, to see which would be the better way of organizing a modern industrial society. But China and the US are both vital, irreplaceable parts of one global system. This global system was established and grew and took root during that short, historically abnormal period from 1989. It has, however, outlasted the period American dominance, and I think it will outlast. They are both vital elements of this system, connected to each other and to the rest of us by a historically new phenomenon. That historically new phenomenon are supply chains of a density, of a complexity, and of a scope never before seen in any previous period of world history. There have been previous periods of interdependence between major powers, that's true. But interdependence of a different kind. In fact, the very metaphor of a supply chain is a bit misleading, because a chain is an essentially simple structure, it's just linear. Right? But the kind of complex system that has developed is much more akin to a tree. There's a root system of a tree, very complicated root system, leading to a trunk, leading to branches, leading to twigs, leading to leaves. And there's a whole forest of them that grew up in that short, historically abnormal period. And that, I think, will not bifurcate completely into two different systems, as existed between the US and the Soviet Union. There will be partial bifurcation. There will be partial bifurcation in specific domains, as Janet Yellen made clear recently, mainly in high-tech domains. It's already happening, and there will be more bifurcation in these domains, mainly high-tech with national security implications. But I find it very impossible to imagine this whole thing completely splitting into two separate systems. Neither the US nor China are very comfortable with this because their mutual interdependence exposes mutual vulnerabilities. And they both are trying to mitigate those vulnerabilities by different strategies. US basically a strategy of diversification of their supply chains to reduce dependence on China. And the Chinese by a strategy of becoming more self-reliant and trying to rely more on domestic consumption to drive their growth. Both strategies are unlikely to succeed to the extent that those who pursue them would like. I'll give you one example. One of the very serious Chinese vulnerabilities are high-end semiconductors, right? And it's a very serious vulnerability, and it's going to be very difficult for the Chinese to breach that gap. They have kind of been trying to develop high-end semiconductors by themselves for the last almost 20 years, well before this trade war and this current phase. But they kind of got stalled at the mid-level. Right? And there are many reasons for this. Right? And it's very hard for them to break through. It is a problem for them because all the most crucial nodes in the semiconductor supply chain are being held by the US, its allies, its friends, its partners. Right? But China is about 40% of the world semiconductor market, and semiconductors in China are not just for China. Their production in China of medium and low-range semiconductors for others, right? And China does control certain things, some of the rare earths, for example, that you need, right? And you can't possibly cut off the companies of your friends, your partners, your allies from 40% of any market. Forget about just semiconductors without doing them grievous damage. There's somebody from Wall Street Journal here. Who is that? Who? Well, last year, no, not year before last. 2021 or 2022, I can't remember. Anyway, Wall Street Journal published a very interesting article using U.S. customs data, which showed that, I can't remember the exact figure, but most of the applications for licenses for export to China, something like 90%, were actually approved. Because you can't possibly cut off all your companies from that huge market. The fact is, they will have to adopt a very targeted approach. And they are moving that way. That's why they have changed the rhetoric, right? However, I don't believe, and I've been asking my American friends and last year, and I'm going to the US again, I'll ask them again, I don't think I'll get a different answer, is that they don't have the bureaucratic administrative infrastructure to pursue a very targeted approach. You need an enormous, every damn thing has some American IP in it. Okay, I'm not surprised. This notebook might have some American IP in it somewhere, you know, because it's not just the product, it's the processes to make the product. Right? So I don't see how you can do it. You can do it, right? All right. You can do it in very specific domains, and it is a real problem for China because it creates huge uncertainties. It creates uncertainties for companies who may not want to take the risk. It creates uncertainties for Chinese producers because they are not sure whether or not they're going to get something. And that uncertainty is the real weapon, if you ask me, right? Well, on the Chinese side, this idea of becoming more self-reliant is, easier said than done. And relying on, trying to rely on domestic household consumption is going to be very difficult. They've been trying again for longer than 20 years, and they kind of stalled out at around 39%, less than 40% anyway. And actually, for economy their size, it's on the average about 50%. So there's a considerable gap. And made worse by all the things Mr. Xi Jinping has done in the last 10 years, which have kind of destroyed confidence. Confidence will come back, but there is a very fundamental issue here of what kind of economy is the Chinese going to be. And I'll come back to that, right? So I think for both sides, they're not going to succeed. They're going to compete within a system. The competition is real, by the way. It's not, but it's different. It's a much more complex competition. The choices facing them, each other, are not binary. Choices facing us are not binary. Although both sides try their best to impose a binary frame of mind on the rest of us. Although they claim they don't want you to choose, actually they do, right? And it's not, and this is a more crucial point, it's a very fierce competition. And China is a formidable competitor, but it is not an existential competition because the survival of the system is not in question. Because China is actually the main beneficiary of this system that grew up in that short period. So why should they want to kick over the table, and replace it with something completely different? Assuming they can, which I don't think they can. They don't have the capability, right? And I'll come back to that also. But much more fundamentally, if you are going to rely on household consumption, you need a much better social safety net system in China. And they understand this, they recognize it, but again, it's going to be difficult to build it in a huge country like China. It's going to take a long time, it's going to take a lot of resources. And China's resources are vast, but they are not infinite, as we are finding out. So to get more resources, what you need to do? You need growth, right? But growth is slowing, and I think the future is of slower growth. I'm not saying China is going to collapse. And that brings me to a very fundamental point about the Chinese economy, which I don't think is sufficiently stressed in a stark way, or in your mind. China is a communist country. We tend to forget that in the excitement of reform. For quite a number of years, we forgot it's a communist country. Not in its ideology anymore. I told you its ideology is Han nationalism with socialist characteristics, but certainly in its political structure. Now, in 2012, at the 18th Party Congress, the Chinese Communist Party acknowledged publicly that the growth model that brought it spectacular results in the 1990s and the first decade of the 2000s was not sustainable over the long run. That growth model is essentially a very heavy emphasis on huge infrastructure investment led by state-owned enterprise. I'm simplifying, but that's the core of it, right? That's 2012. They acknowledge it. Nobody made them do it. They did it themselves because they are not stupid people and they know the vulnerability of their own system. The next year, 2013, they rolled out a new growth model that essentially, again, I'm simplifying, but the core was what they call a decisive role for the market in allocating resources. In other words, more economic efficiency. However, this set up a very fundamental contradiction. The core value of a Leninist system or a communist system is control. Not just political control, but control over everything, over the economy, over culture, over every aspect of state and society. But more economic efficiency, by definition, means less control. Now, it's not an absolute choice. It's not A or B, but it's what is the new balance between control and economic efficiency. They haven't been figured out. That new model, which they rolled out in 2013, I've read some academic articles that suggest maybe no more than 15 to 20% has been implemented. Because they cannot figure out what is the new balance. And under Xi Jinping, the emphasis has been clearly on more political control, more party discipline, more party control over the economy and so on. And right now you see it, they are facing slow growth. So they are trying to talk up the private sector. Private sector is so far not buying it. Because, once you lose confidence, very hard to restore it, Now, I'm not saying China is going to collapse. China is not going to collapse, but it's going to perform suboptimally. They are master improvisers. And there is, look, Xi Jinping is clearly a party man to the marrow of his bones. He does recognize the importance of the economy because the party's legitimacy does depend on economic performance. But his solution over the last 10 years, the first 10 years of the rule, to every problem has been more party. Right now, he had a major reversal on zero COVID, which was a stupid policy in the first place. But I don't think he had a choice. His hand was forced. There were very large demonstrations across China. Your colleague, my friend Wong Chuhan, right? We had many, his hand was forced because those large demonstrations brought together workers and students. And if you know the history of the Chinese Communist Party or China's modern political history, this is a very dangerous combination. He had no choice. He relaxed the restrictions on the high tech, but that's within new walls that he has erected. He was doing the right thing about trying to let the air out of the property bubble. You can argue about his methods, but the goal was correct because it was a huge bubble. Maybe as much as a quarter of China's GDP it ultimately rests on very dodgy property deals. Okay, and that has a cascade effect. Then you have local government finances which are horrible, and then you have commercial banks that have given these loans to the local government. And it's not going to collapse, but it certainly is going to be a huge drag. And over that, of course, you have the demographic factor. As I said, it's not going to collapse, but they face this fundamental dilemma of what's the new balance. The things that he has relaxed recently, but you see, I think they haven't made up their mind. I think they are quite sincere about wanting to continue with reform because they know ultimately their legitimacy depends on it, right? On the other hand, they are also quite paranoid, and the Chinese Communist Party has always been this paradoxical creature that is simultaneously extremely powerful and extremely insecure. And it's not entirely paranoia because you have never had an example in world history of such a huge country undergoing such fundamental transformation in a relatively short period of time, say about 30 years, right? a huge, I think I can't remember which year, but a few years ago, for the first time, more people are living in cities in China than in the countryside. And that really roils up society. So they are not paranoid to be concerned about social stability. But it does enhance the contradiction that they face. So it's not a new cohort. So it's not an existential fight. They don't want to destroy the system because that will make it worse for everybody themselves. And the stakes are higher for them, you know. Look, if let's say Singapore government mucks up, right, the economy, what is the worst that can happen? Or the U.S. government mucks up the economy, which it does regularly. What's the worst that can happen? The worst that can happen, you throw the rascals out and elect a new bunch of rascals, but the system is preserved. The stakes are higher for China. It is the systemic preservation. Right? So I think they are quite sincere about wanting to preserve, wanting to continue with reform. They're also quite sincere about their insecurities. And I said it's not completely sheer paranoia. And of course, because we are now in a new era of strategic competition, those insecurities have a very large external dimension. Right? Therefore, you have, for example, this new espionage law, and you have Premier Li Cheng going around telling the private sector, "I love you guys deeply," you know, and there are contradictory imperatives. But anyway, it's not an existential competition; it's a fierce competition, and that brings me to my penultimate point. Yeah, I'm still more or less within the thing. A bit over, but okay, I don't think the risk that we face is a war by design between the US and China. A war by design means war as an instrument of policy. The risk you face is an accident getting out of hand. Because both sides are being driven right now anyway by their domestic politics. There's a certain amount of hubris on both sides, right? And that risk of accident getting out of hand is highest over Taiwan. Right? Now, and this is the last point, I don't believe that the Chinese will ever renounce the use of force for Taiwan. That's, I take it as given. On the other hand, I don't believe they are eager to use force to reunify Taiwan. It's not their preferred option. They will never give it up, but it's not their preferred option. It's not their preferred option for a very simple reason. Two reasons. One, the immediate reason is they just don't have the capability. You may have heard the year 2027 being thrown around as when they may attack Taiwan. I think that mistakes capability with intention now. Well, they may develop the capability by 2027, right? But that's not to be taken for granted. But even if they develop the capability, I don't think they'll be very keen to reunify Taiwan by force because it will be a tremendous gamble. An immense gamble. And a gamble they cannot lose. Because it will not merely, whoever is the leader at that time will lose power for sure. It will also rock the roots of the party rule severely. So, and they have other options in their arsenal, non-kinetic options. But there are some scenarios in which they must fight, and we can talk about that later. But I don't think it's their preferred option. Okay, I'll stop here. Wait, do I have anything else? Yeah, I'll stop here and let's have a discussion.
I have a naive question.
Can you identify yourself? Because I would like to know who I'm talking to.
Komet Sohaili.
No, my eyes are very bad. I can't read
Yeah. My name is Komet Sohaili. I'm from Iran, living in South Korea.
Yeah.
I'm freelance journalist and filmmaker. I have a naive question.
Naive questions are the dangerous ones. Yeah.
Because kind of compare Cold War. I mean, you say it's not a Cold War because it's not existential.
And it's a competition within a system.
It is, yeah, competition. But in another perspective, like a Cold War finish, one of the reasons was because it was existential and it could collapse the humanity itself. But now, considering the seriousness of climate change, do you think, because of this development, this kind of developments is actually leading to this global climate change, do you think this seriousness can change this way of competition between these two major powers?
Well, yeah, since you're from Iran, lucky you don't live there, because Iran is one of the biggest victims of climate change. The short answer to your question is unfortunately not. I tell you why. Irrespective of the kind of system, whether it's a democratic system or authoritarian system, dealing with climate change confronts all politicians, all kinds of politicians or political systems with a fundamental dilemma. To deal effectively with climate change, I'm talking nationally now, forget about the international. Internationally, I will come back to it. It requires a huge investment upfront, and you get your returns only way down the road. Now, for any kind of politician, this is not a winning equation. You put that all together, the prospects of international collaboration, the immediate imperatives are always going to overwhelm the long-term imperatives. And John Kerry went to China recently, you know that, and they talked nicely, and that's good, that's all to the good. But at the same time, while John Kerry was there, or just before, I forget the timing exactly, Xi Jinping did say in a speech that China will do its own thing about climate. China is taking climate change seriously. They will deal with it, but they will deal with it in their own way by themselves. And that's not unique to China. No, most countries adopt that attitude because the prospects of meaningful international collaboration on climate change are not high, unfortunately. So the short answer to the question is unfortunately no.
Hi, I'm Lisa from the Wall Street Journal. I was curious about what's happening with the Belt and Road projects, because probably about a decade ago, China had come to the region and offered so much money in terms of financing, like transport or infrastructure. So how, what's the latest on that? And are countries in the region eager for more of that? Or what's the attitude now?
In region, you mean Southeast Asia or East Asia or where? Or just generally speaking, okay. Okay, first of all, I have always been from the very beginning skeptical about the Belt and Road project. It is a collection of individual projects wrapped up in a slogan presented as a strategy. Every goddamn thing is Belt and Road. If I get my contractor to repair my toilet and he has a Chinese laborer, I told him, please don't call it a Belt and Road project. Okay, right? But that's practically what they did. I'm exaggerating, of course, right? Now, I don't think it's a collection of projects. So some projects, by the nature, will work better than others. Some will fail. Some will be scaled down. All this is happening, not just in Southeast Asia, throughout the world. There is no reason why Southeast Asian countries who need the infrastructure should not participate. Why should they not participate? Because it's going to be very hard. Large-scale infrastructure projects, China had an advantage because it's very hard to do this on a commercial basis. It's almost impossible to make money out of it. And if you can make money, again, it's like climate change. You have a huge amount of capital outlay upfront, and maybe 25 years down the road, you get your money back, if you're lucky with a bit of profit. Now, who on earth, which commercially run company wants to do this? Except very rarely. So if the Chinese want to do it, good luck to them. But I think it's becoming clear that they can't subsidize unviable projects forever. Anybody from Pakistan here? Okay. Now, you know Pakistan is China's all-weather friend. You know China has poured enormous amounts of money in Pakistan. And you know China is going to continue to pour enormous amount of money in that black hole, which is the Pakistani economy. When my American friends worry about Guada and all that, I say, why do you worry? when your adversary is making a mistake, never stop them. Right? So, same to do with Iran, If China wants to pour money there, good luck. Why not? Some will work, many projects will work. By the way, you know that Port of Singapore Authority International used to manage Guada? Really? Yes. When I was in government, I kept asking them, why the hell do you want to manage a port that is connected to nothing, with no hinterland, right? Who has ruled Balochistan ever? Nobody has ever ruled Balochistan properly, right? Even today, the Pakistani army has to go in force, and then they have to leave, right? So I never got a good answer from the Port of Singapore Authority. These port people, they have a different mentality. They kept telling me, it's a very good port. I say, I don't doubt it's a very good port, but it's connected to nothing, so what's the point of running a very good port? And then when I asked PERMSEC, we have a non-resident ambassador to Pakistan, right? I had to forbid him from going to Guada. Why? Because he's Chinese. And you got the Baloch liberation movement killing China. I told him, they're not going to ask for your damn passport, before they start shooting at you, all right? Okay. Okay. All right?
So what's the point of China's interest in Guada?
I think that one is strategic because sooner or later, right now, the Chinese energy routes from the Middle East is being protected by the Fifth Fleet, American Fifth Fleet and the American Seventh Fleet. That's intolerable. So they will need some base sooner or later to protect that energy route. And I don't see anything unusual about this, This is entirely normal, actually, right? The present situation is also abnormal when your chief rival is protecting such a vital commodity route for you. It doesn't make sense.
China's interest in BRI and the Central Asian countries, even in Afghanistan, like
In Central Asia, I think the BRI will work better than other places. It will work, but not by the way, in this very dramatic project of having railroads right across to Europe and so on. Most of those trains are running empty one way. Why? A very simple reason. The unit cost of land transport is always going to be much higher than the unit cost of sea transport. Much higher than what time you may save. So you're going to use those rails only for high value, low volume commodities, mainly electronic component parts for the automobile industry. But high value, low volume, you might as well fly them. It's even cheaper. Right? So that is, but where the BRI works in Central Asia is in the industrial parks along the thing in Kazakhstan and a bit in Uzbekistan. Because these countries don't have many options if they want to economically develop. Who's going to invest in these countries in very large scale? The answer is only China. Right? That's true also in Southeast Asia of Laos. Who on earth is going to invest in Laos on a large scale except China? So I don't blame Laos for taking this thing. I don't blame Indonesia for looking to China for Chinese finance for the infrastructure Indonesia needs. But I think we should not get too excited about the BRI. The Chinese have stopped boasting about it too. You may have noticed. They have been promising for the last year BRI 2.0. That's my term. I mean, a revamp of it. I'm still waiting. What is it? I'll be interested, right? So that's the BRI. I keep telling Western friends, right? So they want to run a port in Greece. What's the big bloody deal? Why are you getting so excited? So they want to run a port in Italy. You know who runs the ports in Italy? Really? It's the mafia. So let's see what happens when two mafias collide. I have no idea. They just say they are going to revamp the thing, right? All I know is they have stopped boasting about it, right? That's all. They've gone a bit quiet. And the last BRI summit was very different from the first one where, there was all rah, 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 This one it went through. So I think what I said about think of it as a collection of projects. And you have to look at those projects on an individual basis. I came to this insight, first of all, I've been very skeptical about these things. I'm always skeptical about these grand designs, when a Chinese friend said that the state-owned company that was forced to take over Hambantota port is extremely upset about it, right? So I went to have a look. This is a few years ago, after New York Times had this big story about Hambantota as if the world is collapsing, right? Debt traps and all that, right? So I went to look at Hambantota. It's a nice port, very small, kind of medium-sized at best, huh? There's only one thing wrong with it. There's no ships in it. Maybe one ship a week or something. So I came back to Singapore and asked some friends who are in the logistics business, and they laughed at me. They said, you people in the government, you don't know important things. But then he told me something that is very obvious, which I admit it never occurred to me. All shipping to Sri Lanka is only for Sri Lanka. It's not like Singapore. More than 90% of shipping comes to Singapore is to break cargo and go to other places. And sometimes, say for India, it comes to Singapore, break cargo here and goes back to India. But Sri Lanka, all things to Sri Lanka, shipping to Sri Lanka is for Sri Lanka. And Sri Lanka is a small economy. It's growing smaller as we speak, right? Sri Lanka has 3 ports. And my friends in logistics saying there's 2 too many. You know? Right? Some projects like Guada, I think Guada has a strategic purpose. The Chinese is not looking for it for commercial reasons. And that's also quite logical. Sri Lanka, the Indians get upset because once I was in India and they were complaining bitterly because the Chinese sent submarines to Sri Lanka and then didn't tell the Indians. I said, friends, why should they tell you? Why should they tell you? Submarines are supposed to be stealthy things. And they also sent it to Karachi and they didn't tell, right? But so why should they tell anybody? Just because it's called the Indian Ocean doesn't mean you own it, you know? Just because it's called the South China Sea doesn't mean it's owned by China. These big countries, they're all much more alike than they would care to admit. Okay, next question.
I'm Pradipta from Forecast News. I'm based in India.
Yeah.
I have 2 questions. We know about China's slower growth.
Yeah.
Can you discuss, what does that mean for other emerging economies? I mean, will we see an increased competition for trade and investment opportunities in other emerging economies? That's one. And second is, if you can clarify, we know from GDP data, latest China's GDP data, from its export data and from its imports data, we know that China has been posting slower growth, slower than expected. But at the same time, we have agencies like International Monetary Fund raising its growth forecast for Asia Pacific as of 2 months ago and saying that China's recovery and India's resilient growth will make up 50% of Asia Pacific's growth this year. So we have confusing data. On one hand, data shows, government data shows that there is slowing growth in China. And on the other hand, we have agencies saying that, its recovery is going to help boost Asia Pacific's growth.
Yeah, it will boost because look, China has a growth target of 5.5%, is it? Something like
That's
that,
right, yes.
Right? And they may or may not make it. And that's probably less than they need to keep up with their labor force expansion. They have very high youth unemployment, as you know. Right? But 5.5% growth in Chinese economy is something like adding an Australia, to the world, to the region,
China itself lowered its growth forecast for this year.
I know, but never mind. Even if it's 4%, that's like adding a very large economy to this region, So I go to India quite often, and you will benefit from it, and some Southeast Asian countries will benefit from the diversion and so on. And generally speaking, the Asia-Pacific or the Indo-Pacific is a good story still for as far as economic development is concerned. Uneven, but still quite good. So even China's slow growth, the problem is much mainly for China, not for the rest of the region. If Chinese economy collapses or really slows down, say 1% or something like that, then we are all in the shit house, okay? Right? So we need them to grow, right? And even if it's slower than before, it's still quite a lot. 5% growth is, I think, something like Australia-sized economy or something like that. a year, for things. India will benefit, but India needs to do more to prepare itself to benefit, frankly. There is a certain thing that distresses me when I talk to my Indian friends. They believe like it's going to be all automatic, right? That, oh, I can't invest in China, I'll invest in India. Yeah, India will be one of the places, but how much investment you can absorb depends. Is your labor force correct? Is your infrastructure ready? Is your regulatory frameworks ready? You know better than me how long it takes to go to courts in India. My great-grandchildren may see a result. All right? So, ditto for the Southeast Asian countries, right? So I think the data is not really contradictory, but it is a problem for China over the long run for slow growth. First, the party's legitimacy, even its nationalist narratives, rest on this foundation of strong growth. How strong, we can argue. Right now, they are facing a huge youth unemployment problem. The May one, that spike of 20%, I think that's a bit abnormal, but still it's going to be quite high, right? And I haven't seen it, but if they publish what is the youth graduate unemployment, I suspect it will be much higher, right? So they have a problem. And over all this is the shadow of the long-term demographics, right? Now, India has got good demographics. But that good demographics of India, a relatively young population, is only good for India if you give them jobs, Otherwise, it's a huge liability. And it's not to, that's why I said I get a bit worried when I hear my Indian friends talking about it, like this is going to be all automatic, There are certain things that need to be done. And truth be told, they are being done at the state level, but in a very uneven way. And actually also India, especially northern India, is going to be very badly affected by climate change. So I think there are pluses and minuses. I don't think that the data is really contradictory, but they are measuring different things in different perspectives, I'll put it that way. I think the slow growth is going to be a big problem for China. I don't think China is going to grow slow forever. It will go up and down. But for the next few years, I think it will be slow. They have to make up their mind, this fundamental contradiction. Where is the new balance? But I don't know. That will require Mr. Xi to say what's wrong. Look, he has been one of the worst emperors as far as governance is concerned. He's a genius at amassing power. There's no doubt about that. But tell me, all of you tell me, just think, one thing he has done in the last 10 years that you can say is an unqualified success. He has not had big failures, but tell me one thing that's an unqualified success. You mentioned Belt and Road, right? They stopped boasting about what? Yeah, but there are multiple reasons for that. And I don't think you can ever eradicate corruption or even reduce it substantially in China. Yeah. He reduced it for the people who are his political opponents. Right? He's reduced it. That's not bad, but it's not an unqualified success because it's also used to consolidate power. Right? So I think he's not a failure at governance, but is he brilliant at governance either. Same could be said about Indians' governments, and most governments in Southeast Asia too. Yeah. Oh, okay.
So this is Manas Pratim Bhuyan. I work for PTI Press Trust of India. It's a national news agency in India. My question is, in fact, I have two questions. One, you talked about China's option of using non-kinetic ways to destabilize Taiwan. Whatever it is. So what could be the option actually non-kinetic? Are you talking about encouraging some elements within Taiwan to create some problem?
Okay.
And second question is, in fact, we have seen increasing conflicts between China and a number of Asian countries, including with India. We have seen conflicts with Japan, Korea. It's long-standing. So do you think China's increasing aggressive behavior is also impacting its overall economic growth and also of Asia?
Okay, first let me deal with Taiwan. That's a good question. Look, there are many things you can do from, cyber things. I just give you one example, which I told somebody about. If I was in the PLA, what I would do is have very frequent but randomly timed live firing exercises around Taiwan and issue all the right NOTAMs, the notice to airmen, notice to mariners. It will completely disrupt trade with Taiwan. And you can't really object because countries can have live firing exercises. Right? But I will do it more frequently and at random intervals. It will make the insurance rates go up. It will make people more wary. It will make life miserable for Taiwan. And that's just one thing I could think of off the top of my head. And there are many other things in terms of cyber domain and so on. Right? However, I think in one sense, and this is a long-term worry, China already lost Taiwan. The prospect of peaceful reunification is almost nil. Because I don't think, you are from Taiwan, right? Tell me how many people in Taiwan think reunification is a great idea? Maybe a couple of old guys lah. All right? But they'll be dead next week or something. Right? I think most people in Taiwan, they just want the status quo to continue. They are not eager to go and declare independence and look for trouble. Which, by the way, your vice president, Mr. Lai Ching-ti, I hope he's not going to turn out to be another Chen Shui-bian. I fear he will, actually. But, that's another issue. Your second question is a very interesting one. I said Mr. Xi Jinping is not great at governance. It's not a failure at governance, it's not great at governance. His foreign policy has been a total failure. Compare how China's international relations and reputation were, let's say at the time of the Beijing Summer Olympics in 2008. Compare it now. Let's go around the region. To the east, Japan. China was once the second most popular, many surveys showed, country in Japan after the US. Until the Ukraine war, it fell below Russia. Now that's a real achievement. You can't do that by accident, You really have to mess up to get that kind of result. Korea. Japan, by the way, is Japan because one essential part of the Japanese national identity is not being part of the Chinese world order since the 16th century. So they are not going to, it's not going to change. Telling my Japanese friend, if I was the self-defense agency, I'll put up a statue of Mr. Xi Jinping in their foyer. Because he is the one that made possible this huge increase in defense budget. He and his friend put it, but mainly him. He is also the architect of the Quad and the architect of AUKUS. None of this could be possible without him. You have Japan, you have Korea. North and South both don't like China. In fact, the North probably distrust China more than they distrust the US. They have told me so. Why? Because their logic is very simple. US is far away. China's next door. Vietnam. There is a Vietnam because for 2 millennia, they refused to become Chinese. Indonesia. Anybody from Indonesia here? Indonesia is a great country. Active dan bebas. Or is it bebas and active? I forget which comes first. And you have a long history. People always worry in the West about Indonesia being overly economically dependent on China, or to put it very bluntly, being bribed by China, certain Indonesian politicians. I keep telling my friends, particularly in the US, Indonesia is active and free. And they have a very special meaning for this because Indonesia has taken money for everybody and done its own thing anyway. and China will learn this. Is learning this, actually. Right? Being pragmatic, and and I keep telling people can be corrupt and still nationalists, In fact, the more corrupt you are, the more nationalistic you become, So don't worry about Indonesia. Nobody will ever be able to capture Indonesia that way, all right? It's too complicated for a start, right? So then you go down, right? There is no country in Southeast Asia, including Laos, who is very dependent, that doesn't have some concerns about China. In fact, there is no country in the world including Pakistan, also very dependent on China, that doesn't have concerns about China. How is this a good foreign policy? Right? China's reputation is better in the south, the global south, than in the north. But China's most important markets, its most important economic partners are in the global north, not in the global south. Global south is basically for resource. Right? Was it last year or year before last, Xi Jinping told a bunch of his cadres, you must make China, what did he say? More lovable, more respectable, and widen your circle of friends. How is that more lovable? That means you're not lovable, right? People hate you. Maybe not. Nobody will ever shun China. But in that, from 2008, the Beijing Olympics, China, there were problems here and there, mainly about human rights, Tibet, at that time. But basically, China's reputation throughout the world was high. Now, there is not a single country that doesn't have some concerns about China. Mind you, there is no country that has not got some concerns about the United States as well. But that's another story, right? So I don't think their foreign policy has been, and the latest thing they did is to go into this no limits partnership with Russia. That is nonsense, When I read that statement, I couldn't believe it. So I went to look, I read the English statement, then I went to look at the Russian statement. I can read Russian, and it's there. Then I asked somebody, my wife, to read the Chinese one, is there. And I know Wang Yi, who was the foreign minister there, and I know Sergei Lavrov. He and I were colleagues in the UN. Wang Yi was my counterpart before he was thing. And they're both, whatever you may think of their policies, they're both quite good diplomats. And there's no good diplomat in any country that will agree this kind of language. What kind of partnership, the no limits? Even a marriage, the closest partnership, there are limits, If you think there are no limits, you go back and tell your spouse, there are no limits in our marriage, you will not be married very long, believe me, okay? Right? So it's nonsense, his foreign policy. He's trying to improve relations with Europe to balance US. But as long as he can't change his position on Ukraine, it's not going to change. It's not going to make a difference. Much as the Europeans would like to be a bit more independent from the US in their approach towards China. Look, both of these countries are more alike than they think they are. The US, after the end of the Cold War, went through a period of hubris. The Chinese, after the global financial crisis, went through a period of hubris. And both of them started drinking their own Kool-Aid too much and believing their own propaganda. Right? About democracy being on the rise, and now the Chinese latest thing is that they have a new way of development. The toe that grows on my head, the hair that grows on my toe laughs. The Chinese way of development is no different from the Japanese way of development, the Singapore way of development, everything. There is how do you best organize modern industrial society? There are only two ways. It was the U.S. European way, based on more emphasis on the market, more emphasis on the rights of the individual, and elections. There is the Soviet way, Russian way, based on a planned economy rather than a market, and based on the dominant position of the vanguard party. These were the only two choices, right? And China chose this way, and most of us chose the other way, but it's not a unique way of development. Every country that develops, Qin Gang, before he disappeared, said that China has shattered the myth that development must mean westernization, and he used westernization with a capital W. Development has always, modernization has always meant westernization, because all the models are Western. The Soviet model, I keep reminding Chinese friends, communism is not an ancient Chinese philosophy, And the vanguard party was not invented by, Lao Tzu or, Qin Shi Huangdi. Okay. So you choose this way, we choose this way, but it's all westernization with a small lowercase w. Okay, because none is a carbon copy of any Western country either. Right? So I think the changes are real because China's rise is real, although geopolitically its situation is not great. And that obviously implies a relative diminution in the position of other countries, including the United States. And the United States made mistakes, like invading Iraq is a mistake. declaring war on terror was a mistake in Afghanistan, which they rectified. Right? Yep.
Hi, Mr. Bilahari. I'm Wong Chia-pek from Channel News Asia.
Yeah.
So my question is a bit more granular, but it does have macro impact. So you look at the implosion of debt within China, right? Like they have to absorb all this debt, all this money they're plonking in. They probably know BRI, monetary, like you said, it's more like they have to do it to secure roots. But within the local government, the LGFV's $3 trillion debt market, that looks to be like on the brink of imploding. How, and then we haven't even considered the issue of the huge property developers.
No,
right?
they're all connected.
Yeah, exactly.
They're all connected. It's a kind of vicious trifecta. The property, dodgy property, local government, financial visitors, commercial banks.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's quite scary when you look at the size of that and what can, if that goes to shit,
Then
literally.
we all go to shit,
Oh, okay. Short answer.
No, I don't think it will go to shit. I tell you why. They know there's a problem. They were dealing with it, I told you. Then they had to reverse course. And they reached for their old tried and trusted instruments. Now, they are forcing the commercial banks to extend the maturity period of these bad loans and so on, right? So as to avoid calling them bad loans. But I tell you, there is one advantage of China having, because it's a communist country. Basically, there's no real private sector. There is a private sector, but it's not really private because if the party tells you to do something, you must do something. So they essentially have one national balance sheet, which gives them much more scope than a normal country to shuffle funds around indefinitely. It's playing whack-a-mole, and it's postponing things, but they can do it much longer than anybody else, and we better hope they can do it much longer than anybody else, otherwise you are all in the shit house. Right? But you're right, there's this trifecta which is all connected. You can do it on a bilateral basis, and you can do it in limited ways, let's say with Saudi Arabia to buy oil and so on, use yuan and so on. But in the end, you look at the scale of the use of dollar, I don't think you can replace. Besides, there is a trust factor. Don't forget that China is a communist country, therefore the interest of the party predominates over everything else. Also, even on a bilateral basis, when there are many deals now being cut to use either rupee or yuan on a bilateral for trade, right? In the end, you're going to end up maybe with a pocket full of yuan. So what are you going to do with it? You can buy some things from China, you can buy something with rupees, you can buy something in India, but it limits your flexibility. So most countries that have a choice are not going to do this except in a very limited way. And the volume of the dollars that are used, there is no alternative really, not for a very long time. So it will happen, there will be more of this happening, but I would think largely on a bilateral scale. And then if you want to use, you and Bangladesh, say you and India, right? They got a huge bunch of Bangladesh rupees, you got a huge bunch of Indian rupees. Where are you going to spend it? Only with each other, right? So you will do it, but only in a limited scope because you can't do it overall. Are you going to denominate all your trade with rupees? You might as well shoot yourself in the head, and be done with it, right? Similarly, many countries, there are countries, I think Malaysia has some deal that they use yuan for certain kinds of trade, but you can't do it with completely. Because what are you going to do with all that yuan? Right? Okay, last question.
Hi, I'm Wenyi Lee from Taiwan Business Weekly. I cover semiconductor.
Yeah.
And so you just talk about China's ambition on taking over Taiwan or its ambition on high-tech, high-end semiconductor. I was just wondering if there's anything that you think Taiwan government could do better so that it can use the semiconductor resources and to prevent itself becoming the victim of the U.S. China tensions.
I don't really understand your question. You mean, yeah, you are a major semiconductor fabricator, and you will always be a major the fabricator, and you are diversifying out of China to Japan, to the U.S., and to, I think, Europe also something is being discussed. But I don't think you can ever leave China completely, right? You just have to be more careful about what you make in China. Somebody who has been in the semiconductor industry told me he worked for Taiwan Semiconductor. He worked for SMIC too. The Singaporean guy, you know, will work for everybody, you know, right? He doesn't believe that China can catch up because he told me something very interesting. He told me that Singapore, for example, can probably design and manufacture one or two of the highest end semiconductors. But one or two semiconductors are useless. You have to make them in the hundreds of millions, if not billions. And that is a totally different process. And he, having worked in China, doesn't believe they can do it. Right? Unless there is a complete quantum shift in the way semiconductors are constructed, which is not impossible either, but not a thing. Now, I think what you meant is, given this advantage Taiwan has, what can you do politically? All you can do is what you're already doing, diversify a bit, but you can't completely shift everything out of China, right? That will really get them riled up against Taiwan, and they will really start ramping up all kinds of different kinds of pressures. But I don't think you should also think it gives you too much leverage. And this is my last point. I have been observing Taiwan for maybe 40, 50 years. It's supposed to be a secret, but it's the worst kept secret. The Singapore military trains in Taiwan. Right? The first time I went to Taiwan for training is 1976, late 70s, early 77. They were one of the first batches. And I've been there 7, 8 times. So I've been observing the Taiwanese military. Taiwanese military will, or the Taiwanese will to define itself has been declining, frankly. And I don't think the shock of Ukraine, you remember during Ma Ying-jeou's time, there was a training accident and a conscript died, right? And 2 defense ministers, one after the other, had to resign. And then you reduce the period of conscription to 4 months. Right? 4 months, let me tell you, you can only train a soldier not to shoot himself in the foot. Okay? Nothing more. For us, our entire full-time service, which is 2 years, 2.5 years, in my time, 3 years, you don't become operational unless you're in the reserve. For us. Because it takes a long time to train a soldier. And you are not buying the right kinds of weapons. Not enough of the right kinds of weapons. Once I noticed, and I was asking some American defense people, contractors, because I noticed a few years ago, Taiwanese bought Abraham tanks. So I asked myself, what the hell they want Abraham tanks for? Because if the Chinese land on Taiwan, it's over. So the point is not to let them land on Taiwan. So you don't need Abraham tanks. What you need is land-to-sea missiles, sea mines. You stop them at sea. It's very hard to cross that strait. Amphibious operations are very hard to do. Right? Kill them out at sea, not let them land. Once they land, you are lost. You have lost. Right? And the reply was, Abraham tanks make for better parades. In ours, it's for show. And they are very fun. I mean, the American defense contractors are very happy to sell Taiwan and things at not discount price, right? But they're also very frustrated as professional military people because you're not buying enough of the right things. So there's one trend I've noticed. And I'm not sure. Now they are discussing increasing it to 1 year, right? The conscription period. Have they already agreed? The period, yeah. Have they agreed? That's why, you see, because there's election next year, I don't think they will agree. Anyway, even 1 year is better than 4 months. In 4 months, you teach a soldier not to shoot himself in the foot. 1 year, you teach him not to shoot himself in the foot and not to shoot his comrade accidentally. Well, not enough. So you have this decline in the will to defend yourself. The other trend I see, which disturbs me a lot, right, is a greater sense of entitlement in Taiwan. Sorry to be frank, right? I am the only Chinese democracy. Somebody must help me. And now I'm the only Chinese democracy and I have chips. Somebody must definitely help me. These two trends together in the context of Taiwanese domestic politics, to me, is very dangerous, right? So that's what, right now you ask me, I worry much more about the Taiwanese side of the Straits than the Chinese side of the Straits. Because there's elections next year, and the election coincides with the American elections, right? So, good luck, but...
My question is, do you think that China can have such plans in future? Because, you know, we don't see any benefit of the infrastructure as such, because we don't
normal
have...
normal people, yeah?
Yeah, normal people.
Well, I'm often asked a variant of this question. Before the pandemic, I was traveling quite intensively around Central Asia because it's a region that interests me. And I was very regularly asked some variant of your question, being, how can we benefit from the Belt and Road without falling into debt traps or other kinds of traps? My answer is always very simple, and it depressed them. My answer was, don't be corrupt.
Thank you so much, and thank you for your extra time.